Good evening, all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. In the vast, frozen wilderness of Alaska, there are small towns where the sun disappears for months at a time. And in that darkness, something far worse than winter takes hold. These are places where your closest neighbor might be 20 miles away, where a scream cannot be heard, and where the line between the living and the dead grows dangerously thin. Tonight, we bring you 10 true accounts from these isolated communities, stories that will make you question whether some places are meant to remain untouched by civilization. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of Alaska's forgotten towns, where civilization ends and terror begins. I have always considered myself a rational person, someone who believes in science and evidence and things that can be measured and proven. I studied marine biology at the University of Washington, spent 4 years learning about ecosystems and species classifications and the chemical composition of seawater. Nothing in my education prepared me for what I would experience when I moved to a small coastal town in southeastern Alaska, population 47 year-round residents, to take a research position studying the impact of climate change on kelp forest ecosystems. And nothing could have prepared me for David, the lighthouse keeper, who died 70 years ago, but apparently never got the message that he was supposed to leave. The town itself was beautiful in that stark, isolated way that Alaska can be. It sat on a rocky peninsula jutting out into the Pacific Ocean, surrounded on 3 sides by water that was so cold it could kill you in minutes if you fell in. The town had been established during the gold rush era in the late 1800s, and while the gold had run out decades ago, a small community had remained, made up mostly of fishermen, artists, and people like me who came for research opportunities. There was one general store, no restaurants, no bars, and definitely no hotels. If you wanted to stay in this town, you either knew someone who would let you crash on their couch, or you found one of the few rental properties available. I found my rental through a woman named Margaret, who ran the general store. She told me about a renovated lighthouse keeper's cottage that was available for a reasonable monthly rate. And when she quoted me the price, I understood why it was so cheap. She hesitated before giving me the address, and then she said something that I should have paid more attention to. She said the cottage was perfectly maintained and safe, but that the previous tenant had left after only 3 months, and the tenant before that had lasted 6 weeks. When I asked why, Margaret looked uncomfortable and said that some people just were not suited for that level of isolation. I told her isolation was exactly what I was looking for, that I needed a quiet place where I could focus on my research without distractions. She gave me the keys and wished me luck in a tone that suggested I was going to need it. The cottage was located about 2 miles from the main part of town, accessible by a narrow gravel road that wound along the coastline. It had been built in the 1920s to house the lighthouse keeper and his family, though the lighthouse itself had been automated in the 1960s and no longer required a permanent keeper. Someone had renovated the cottage within the last decade, updating the plumbing and electrical systems while maintaining the original character of the building. It was small but charming, with large windows that looked out over the ocean, hardwood floors that creaked when you walked on them, and a stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the living room. I loved it immediately. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time setting up my research equipment, organizing my notes, and getting familiar with the kelp forest along the coastline. The work was demanding but satisfying, exactly the kind of immersive research experience I had been hoping for. But on the 4th night, something strange happened that I initially dismissed as my own carelessness. I'd made myself a cup of tea and set it on the kitchen counter while I went to get my laptop from the bedroom. When I came back, less than 2 minutes later, the cup had been moved. It was no longer on the counter where I had left it, but sitting on the small dining table near the window, placed precisely in the center of a placemat, as if someone had carefully repositioned it. I stood there, staring at that cup of tea for a long moment, trying to figure out how it could have moved. I lived alone. The doors and windows were all closed and locked, and I had not heard any sounds of movement. I told myself I must have put it on the table without thinking, that I had been distracted, and my memory was playing tricks on me. I picked up the cup, drank my tea, and went to bed thinking nothing more of it. But it kept happening. Objects would move when I was not looking. My research papers, which I would leave stacked on my desk, would be found neatly arranged on the dining table the next morning. Books would be reshelved in different orders. My coffee mug would migrate from the kitchen counter to the windowsill. It was never anything dramatic or frightening, just small rearrangements that suggested someone else was living in the cottage with me, someone who had very particular ideas about where things should be placed. I mentioned it to Margaret the next time I went into town for supplies, trying to sound casual about it, asking if there was any possibility that someone else had keys to the cottage. She got that same uncomfortable expression on her face and asked me what exactly had been happening. When I described the moving objects, she nodded slowly and said I should probably know about David. That was the first time I heard his name. David Whitmore had been the lighthouse keeper from 1948 until 1953 when he died of a heart attack while on duty. He had been a meticulous man, Margaret told me, someone who kept everything in perfect order and followed the same routine every single day without deviation. He would wake at dawn, check the lighthouse mechanisms, eat his breakfast at exactly 7 in the morning at the dining table by the window, and spend his evenings sitting in the chair by the fireplace reading maritime logs. When they found him after he died, he was sitting in that chair with a logbook open on his lap, as if he had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. Margaret said that every tenant who had lived in the cottage since the renovation had reported the same things I was experiencing. Objects moving, always to the same specific locations: the dining table, the windowsill, the chair by the fireplace. She said most people found it unsettling enough that they eventually left, but that David had never done anything harmful, had never actually appeared to anyone or made threatening gestures. He just seemed to be continuing his routine, even in death, unable or unwilling to accept that his time as lighthouse keeper had ended. I should have been frightened. I should have packed my things and found somewhere else to live. But instead, I found myself strangely comforted by the idea of David. I started leaving my coffee cup in the places where he seemed to want it, stopped fighting against the rearrangement of my papers, and began to think of him as a quiet roommate who I never saw but who shared the space with me. It sounds insane when I say it out loud, but in that isolated cottage, with nothing but ocean and wind and solitude for company, having some evidence of another presence, even a ghostly one, made the place feel less empty. 3 months into my stay, something changed. I woke in the middle of the night to find my bedroom absolutely freezing, so cold that I could see my breath fogging in the air in front of me. This was October in Alaska, so cold temperatures were not unusual, but this was different. The cold was localized to my bedroom, and when I got up to check the thermostat, I found that the heat was working perfectly fine, and the rest of the cottage was warm. I wrapped a blanket around myself and walked into the living room, and that is when I saw him for the first time. He was standing at the large window that faced the ocean, his back to me, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned lighthouse keeper's uniform, dark pants, and a heavy wool sweater with a thick belt around the waist. He stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the water. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, unable to move or speak or even breathe properly. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a minute or two, just watching him watch the ocean, and then slowly, he turned his head to look at me. His face was weathered and lined, the face of a man who had spent decades staring into wind and salt spray. His eyes were a pale gray color, and they looked sad, infinitely sad, as if he was carrying some burden that he could not put down. We stared at each other across that dark room, and I waited for fear to overwhelm me. Waited to scream, or run, or do any of the things you are supposed to do when confronted with something impossible. But the fear never came. Instead, I felt a strange sense of calm, as if David was trying to communicate something to me without words, trying to tell me that he meant no harm. His lips moved, and I saw him mouth 2 words, "Storm coming." And then he simply faded away, becoming transparent and then invisible, until there was nothing left but the empty window and the sound of wind beginning to pick up outside. I stood there in my blanket for a long time after he disappeared, trying to process what I had just seen, storm coming. I walked to the window and looked out at the ocean, which was beginning to churn with increasingly violent waves. The wind was picking up rapidly, and I could see dark clouds rolling in from the west. I checked my phone and saw that there was a severe weather alert that had been issued an hour earlier while I was sleeping, warning of a major storm system moving into the area, with winds expected to reach 70 miles per hour. I suddenly remembered that my research boat was still docked at the small pier about half a mile down the coast. I'd been planning to move it to the protected harbor in town the next day, but the next day was now too late. If that boat was still at the exposed pier when the storm hit, it would be destroyed, along with all of my expensive research equipment that was stored on board. I threw on my warmest clothes and practically ran through the darkness to the pier, fighting against wind that was already strong enough to make me stagger. I managed to get the boat started and navigated it to the protected harbor just as the first massive waves began to crash against the shore. The storm turned out to be the worst one that region had seen in 30 years. Trees were uprooted, power lines were downed, and the exposed pier where my boat had been docked was completely destroyed, reduced to splinters, and twisted metal by the force of the waves. If I had not moved the boat when I did, I would have lost everything. My research, my equipment, potentially my entire career, and I would not have known to move it if David had not appeared to warn me. After that night, I saw him occasionally, always at times when dangerous weather was approaching. He would appear at the window in his lighthouse keeper's uniform, would turn to look at me with those sad gray eyes, and would mouth his warning before fading away. I learned to trust those warnings completely, and more than once they saved me from being caught unprepared by sudden storms or dangerous tide conditions. I lived in that cottage for 2 full years, and David became a presence that I relied on, a guardian who watched over me the way he had once watched over ships navigating the treacherous coastal waters. I never felt afraid of him, never felt threatened. If anything, I felt protected. I eventually had to leave Alaska when my research grant ended, and I accepted a position at an oceanographic institute in California. On my last night in the cottage, I sat by the window, where David always appeared, and spoke out loud to the empty room. I thanked him for watching over me, for keeping me safe, for sharing his home with me. I do not know if he heard me, but as I sat there in the darkness, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and I felt what I can only describe as a gentle pressure on my shoulder, as if someone had placed a hand there in farewell. I think about David often, especially during storms. I wonder if he is still there in that cottage, still keeping watch over the ocean, still warning whoever lives there now about approaching danger. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is blowing hard, I swear I can still feel that gentle pressure on my shoulder, reminding me that some protectors never stop watching, even after death. I need to start this by saying that I never believed evil could exist in a place as small and isolated as my town. When you live somewhere with 150 permanent residents, where everyone has known each other for decades, where you can leave your doors unlocked and your keys in your truck without a second thought, you start to think that the darkness you hear about on the news and read about in papers is something that happens somewhere else, to other people, in big cities, where strangers pass each other on the street without making eye contact. I was wrong about that, and the wrongness of it has haunted me every day for the past 8 years. My name is Michael, and I own the only general store in a town that sits about 60 miles inland from the coast of southeastern Alaska. The town does not have an official name on any map, though locals call it Timber Ridge because it sits nestled in a valley surrounded by densely forested mountains. We get supplies flown in once a week during the summer and once every 2 weeks during winter, depending on weather conditions. My store is the lifeblood of the community. It is where people get their groceries, their hardware supplies, their mail, and their gossip. I know every single person who walks through my door. I know what they buy, what they can afford, what vices they indulge in when they think no one is paying attention. I know who drinks too much, who is struggling to make ends meet, who is having marital problems. In a town this small, a general store owner becomes a combination of supply keeper, counselor, and confidant, whether he wants to or not. Benjamin Taylor had been coming to my store since I opened it 15 years ago. He was in his mid-50s, a logger who worked for one of the small timber operations that still functioned in the area. He was quiet, kept to himself mostly, but he was reliable and decent. He lived alone in a cabin about 3 miles outside of town, had never married, and seemed content with his solitary existence. Every Thursday afternoon, he would come into the store, buy the same things: coffee, canned soup, bread, tobacco, and we would exchange the same pleasantries about weather and work. It was a routine that had played out hundreds of times over the years, comfortable and predictable. About 2 months before it happened, I noticed that Benjamin was acting different. He seemed nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder, as if he expected someone to be standing behind him. His hands would shake slightly when he counted out cash to pay for his purchases. He started asking me strange questions that I did not think much of at the time, but which I have replayed in my mind 1,000 times since. He asked if I had ever upgraded the locks on the store, if I thought the old ones were secure enough. He asked if I had security cameras, which I did not, because what would be the point in a town where everyone knew everyone? He asked if I ever felt like I was being watched when I was alone in the store late at night. I told him he seemed stressed, asked if everything was all right with him. He hesitated, opened his mouth like he was going to say something important, then closed it again and shook his head. He said he had just been having trouble sleeping, that the isolation of living alone was getting to him more than usual. I suggested he should come into town more often, spend time at the community hall where people gathered in the evenings to play cards and catch up. He said he would think about it, but I could tell from the way he said it that he would not. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening in March, Benjamin showed up at the store about 30 minutes after I had officially closed. I was in the back room doing inventory when I heard someone knocking on the front door. I almost did not answer because I was tired and wanted to finish up and go home, but something about the urgency of the knocking made me reconsider. When I opened the door, Benjamin was standing there, looking worse than I had ever seen him. His face was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and he had the appearance of someone who had not slept properly in days. He apologized for coming so late, said he needed to pick up a few things, and had not been able to make it earlier in the day. I let him in, watched as he walked through the aisles gathering items, his movements jerky and uncertain. He kept looking toward the windows as if he could see something moving outside in the darkness. When he came to the counter to pay, he leaned in close and spoke in a low voice, almost a whisper. He said he thought someone had been following him, that he had seen signs that someone had been near his cabin when he was away. He said he had found footprints in the snow around his property, footprints that were not his own. I did not know what to say to that. In a town this small, everyone knew where everyone lived, and it was not uncommon for people to check on neighbors, especially those who lived alone. But the fear in Benjamin's eyes was real, and it made me uncomfortable. I asked him if he had reported it to the state troopers, and he said he had thought about it, but did not have any proof, just footprints that could belong to anyone. He paid for his items and left, and that was the last time I saw him alive. The next morning, I arrived at the store at my usual time, 6 in the morning, planning to prepare for the supply delivery that was scheduled to arrive later that day. When I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, I immediately knew something was wrong. There was a smell in the air, metallic and unpleasant, and the back storage room door was standing open when I distinctly remembered locking it the night before. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but got no response. I walked slowly toward the storage room, my heart beginning to pound in a way that made my chest feel tight. Benjamin was lying on the floor of the storage room, face down in a pool of blood that had spread out around his head and shoulders. I did not scream. I did not move. I just stood there in the doorway, staring at his body, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. His skull had been crushed, caved in on the left side by some kind of blunt force that had killed him almost instantly based on the amount of blood. His arms were at his sides, and there were no signs of defensive wounds, no indication that he had fought back or even seen the attack coming. I backed out of the storage room, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand, and called the state troopers from the phone behind the counter. It took them 4 hours to arrive because they had to fly in from the nearest post, which was 200 miles away. During those 4 hours, I sat outside the store in my truck, unable to go back inside, unable to stop seeing Benjamin's body every time I closed my eyes. The troopers treated it as a murder scene from the moment they arrived. They photographed everything, collected evidence, interviewed me extensively about when I had last seen Benjamin alive and what condition the store had been in when I closed the night before, and then they discovered something that turned the entire situation from tragic to completely inexplicable. The store had been locked from the inside. The front door, which was the only entrance customers used, had been locked with the deadbolt, which could only be engaged from inside the building. The back door, which I used for deliveries, had also been locked and showed no signs of forced entry. The windows were all intact and locked from the inside as well. The security of my store was simple but effective. When I closed for the night, I would lock the front door deadbolt from the inside, exit through the back door, and lock it behind me with a key. The back door automatically locked when it closed, and I was the only person who had a key to it. Benjamin had a key to the front door because he was a friend and I had given it to him years ago so he could pick up supplies if I was away. But that key only worked on the front door, not the deadbolt. The troopers checked every possible explanation. They examined the locks and found no signs they had been picked or tampered with. They searched the entire building, including the ceiling and crawl spaces, looking for any hidden entrance or exit point. They found nothing. They reviewed the timeline and determined that Benjamin must have entered the store sometime between 10 at night, when I locked up and left, and 6 in the morning when I returned. But there was no explanation for how he got inside, how his killer got inside, or how his killer escaped from a building that was locked from the inside. The murder weapon was never found. The troopers searched the store, searched the surrounding area, searched the entire town. They interviewed every resident, looked into Benjamin's background, investigated anyone who might have had a reason to want him dead. They found nothing. Benjamin had no enemies that anyone knew of, had not been involved in any disputes or arguments, had not owed anyone money. He was just a quiet man who kept to himself and worked hard and hurt no one. The most disturbing part of the investigation came when they examined the security of the crime scene. My store did not have cameras, but it did have motion sensor lights outside that would turn on if anyone approached the building at night. Those lights had not been triggered. The snow around the store, which had fallen lightly the night before, showed only my footprints from when I arrived that morning. There were no other tracks, no indication that anyone else had approached the building during the night. The Alaska State Troopers kept the case open for months, following every lead, re-interviewing witnesses, bringing in specialists to examine the locks and the scene. But eventually, with no new evidence and no viable suspects, the case went cold. It remains unsolved to this day, 8 years later. The official file lists it as a homicide, with unknown perpetrator and unknown means of entry and exit. I sold the store 6 months after it happened. I could not bring myself to work there anymore, could not walk past that storage room without seeing Benjamin's body, without smelling that metallic scent of blood. A couple from Anchorage bought it and renovated the space, trying to erase what had happened there. But everyone in town still knows. Everyone still talks about it in hushed voices, still wonders what really happened that night. I have spent 8 years trying to make sense of it, trying to find some logical explanation that I might have missed. But there is none. Benjamin Taylor died in a locked room with no way for his killer to have entered or escaped. The murder weapon disappeared. There were no witnesses, no evidence, no suspects. It is as if someone killed him and then vanished into thin air, leaving behind only questions in a town full of people who no longer feel safe in the place they call home. I think about Benjamin often, about the fear I saw in his eyes the last time I spoke to him, about the way he said someone had been following him. Maybe he was right. Maybe someone had been watching him, stalking him, waiting for the right moment. But how they got into that locked store and how they got out again without leaving a single trace is something I will never understand. And that not knowing is the worst part of all. There are some places in Alaska that feel wrong, and I do not mean wrong in the way that a dark alley in a city might feel dangerous or the way an abandoned building might feel eerie. I mean wrong in a way that makes your body react before your brain can catch up. Wrong in the way that animals sense an earthquake before it happens. My family's hunting cabin is one of those places, and what happened there 3 years ago is something I still cannot explain no matter how many times I replay the events in my mind. The cabin has been in my family for 3 generations, built by my grandfather in 1962, when he first moved to Alaska from Montana. It sits in a remote valley, about 50 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a rough logging road that becomes impassable during winter. The cabin itself is modest, just 2 bedrooms, a main living area with a wood stove, and a small kitchen. There is no electricity, no running water, and no phone service. You bring in what you need, you pack out what you use, and you rely on yourself because there is no one coming to help you if something goes wrong. Every fall, for as long as I can remember, my family has made the trip to the cabin for a week of hunting. It is a tradition that goes back to my grandfather, continued by my father, and now includes me and my 2 brothers. We hunt for moose and caribou. We fish in the creek that runs behind the cabin, and we spend our evenings sitting around the wood stove telling stories and playing cards. Those weeks at the cabin are some of my favorite memories. Moments of simplicity and connection that feel increasingly rare in the modern world. The cabin is always locked when we are not using it. We winterize it before we leave each year, draining the water lines, covering the furniture, securing the shutters, and making sure everything is protected from the elements and from any animals that might try to get inside. My father is meticulous about this process, checking and double-checking every detail before we drive away. The cabin sits empty for 11 months of the year, isolated and undisturbed in that remote valley. 3 years ago, we made our annual trip in mid-September. It was my father, my 2 brothers, William and David, and myself. We left town early on a Saturday morning, drove the rough logging road for 3 hours, and finally pulled up to the cabin around noon. The first thing I noticed was smoke. There was smoke coming from the chimney, thin and gray, drifting up into the clear autumn sky. We all saw it at the same time, and we all had the same reaction. We stopped the truck about 50 yards from the cabin and just sat there, staring at that impossible smoke. My father was the first to speak. He said maybe someone had broken in, maybe hikers or hunters who needed shelter, though we all knew that was unlikely. The cabin was not on any established trail, and the logging road was not marked on any public maps. You would have to know exactly where you were going to find it. He told us to stay in the truck while he checked it out, but William and I ignored him and followed as he approached the cabin slowly, calling out to announce our presence. The front door was still locked. The padlock we had placed on it the previous year was hanging exactly where we had left it, secured and showing no signs of tampering. My father unlocked it and pushed the door open, and we were hit with a wave of warm air that smelled like wood smoke and something else, something I could not quite identify. We stepped inside, and what we found made no sense whatsoever. The cabin was warm. The wood stove was burning with a healthy fire, the kind that takes time and attention to build. Someone had split firewood and stacked it neatly beside the stove. The furniture that we had covered was uncovered, the sheets folded precisely and placed in a pile on one of the beds. The shutters we had secured were open, letting in afternoon light. And in the kitchen, there was food, fresh food, bread that was still soft, cheese that had not spoiled, apples that were not bruised or rotting. On the table, there were 4 place settings with plates and utensils arranged as if someone had been expecting us for a meal. We stood there in silence, trying to process what we were seeing. My father checked every room, looked in every closet and under every bed. There was no one else in the cabin. The beds we had left stripped and covered were now made with blankets we had never seen before, quilts with patterns that were unfamiliar. In the bathroom, there were towels hanging that did not belong to us, clean and dry as if they had just been laundered. William found the guest book we kept on the shelf by the door, the book where visitors were supposed to sign their names and leave a note about their stay. He flipped through the pages, looking for any entry from the past year. There was nothing. The last entry was from our previous trip, dated September of the year before. No one had signed the book. No one had left any indication of who they were or why they had been there. That first night, we tried to rationalize it. Maybe the previous year we had not secured the cabin as well as we thought. Maybe someone had broken in months ago and had been using it as a shelter. Maybe they had left recently, maybe just hours before we arrived, and we had somehow missed seeing them leave. But none of those explanations accounted for the fresh food, for the fire that was burning when we arrived, for the eerie sense that the cabin had been prepared specifically for our arrival. We decided to stay. We had come for a week of hunting, we had supplies and gear, and we were not going to let some unexplained circumstances drive us away from our family tradition. We took turns keeping watch that first night, making sure that whoever had been there did not come back. But nothing happened. The cabin was quiet except for the sound of wind in the trees and the occasional crack of the wood stove settling. The second night was when things escalated. We had spent the day hunting, had seen some moose tracks but had not taken any shots, and had returned to the cabin in the late afternoon to prepare dinner. As the sun set and darkness fell, we started hearing sounds. Footsteps on the roof, heavy and deliberate, walking from one end of the cabin to the other. We went outside with flashlights shining them up at the roof, but there was nothing there. The footsteps continued, directly above our heads, impossible to ignore. Then came the knocking. It started on the walls, rhythmic and purposeful, 3 knocks, followed by a pause, then 3 more knocks. It moved around the cabin, knocking on different walls, always 3 knocks at a time. We checked outside again, walked the perimeter of the cabin with our rifles ready, but found nothing. No footprints in the soft ground around the foundation, no signs that anyone or anything had been there. On the 3rd night, we heard voices. They were speaking in a language I did not recognize, low and rhythmic, almost like chanting. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding the cabin, but never quite locating to a specific direction. David said it sounded like the native languages his college roommate used to speak, but he could not be certain. The voices continued for hours, rising and falling in intensity, never quite loud enough to make out individual words, but clear enough to know they were there. On the final night, the night before we had planned to leave, something happened that made us abandon the cabin in the middle of the night. I woke around 2 a.m. to use the bathroom, and when I walked through the main living area, I saw them. Handprints. Muddy handprints were appearing on the inside of the windows, one after another, as if invisible hands were pressing against the glass from inside the cabin. not from outside where an intruder might be, but from inside where we were supposedly alone. I watched in frozen horror as print after print materialized on the window glass, small hands and large hands appearing in the condensation and mud that should not have been there. I woke my father and brothers, and we all saw it. We watched as the handprints continued to appear, covering every window in the cabin, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. We grabbed what we could carry, left everything else behind, and drove away in the darkness, not stopping until we reached the main highway 3 hours later. We reported it to the Alaska State Troopers the next day. They agreed to send someone out to investigate, though it took them a week to coordinate the trip because of how remote the location was. When they finally made it to the cabin, they found it exactly as we had left it the year before. Winterized, covered, locked, and empty. The fresh food was gone. The trees' unfamiliar blankets were gone. The fire in the wood stove had been cold for what they estimated was months based on the ash. They photographed the windows, looking for the handprints we described, but found nothing except normal dust and condensation patterns. We have not been back to the cabin in 3 years. My father talks sometimes about selling it, but who would buy a property that remote with a story like ours attached to it? I did some research after we got back, talking to people in the nearest town, asking about the history of that valley. An elder from the local native community eventually told me that the land where our cabin sits was a burial ground, used by her people for generations before white settlers arrived. She said the dead do not like to be disturbed, that they have ways of making the living understand they are not welcome. I do not know what we experienced in that cabin. I do not know if it was spirits, if it was something else entirely, or if there is some rational explanation that we simply cannot see. All I know is that my family's tradition ended that week, and none of us have any desire to go back and find out what happens if we stay longer than we did. I have been a bush pilot in Alaska for 23 years, and in that time I have seen things that most people would not believe. I have flown through storms that turned the sky black at noon. I have landed on frozen lakes where the ice groaned beneath my wheels like something alive, and I have navigated through mountain passes where one wrong move would have sent me crashing into granite walls. But nothing I have experienced in all those years of flying prepared me for what I saw in that village during the ice fog, and nothing has been able to convince me that what I witnessed was anything other than supernatural. For those who do not know, ice fog is a phenomenon unique to the interior of Alaska, occurring when temperatures drop to 40 below zero or colder. The moisture in the air freezes instantly, creating a thick fog made of ice crystals that can reduce visibility to just a few feet. It hangs low to the ground, dense and white, and it creates an eerie silence because the ice crystals absorb sound in a way that regular fog does not. When you are standing in ice fog, the world becomes muffled and distant, as if you have been wrapped in cotton and separated from reality. It is disorienting even for people who have lived in Alaska their entire lives, and for outsiders, it can be genuinely frightening. The village where this happened is one I had been servicing for about 5 years at that point. It is located in the interior, about 200 miles from Fairbanks, with a population that fluctuates between 70 and 90 people depending on the season. Most of the residents are native Alaskans, though there are a few white families who have lived there for generations. The village has no road access, so everything comes in by plane or by river barge during the brief summer months. I flew in supplies twice a month, sometimes more often if there was a medical emergency or if the weather had prevented flights for an extended period. It was January when it happened, the coldest part of the winter, when the sun barely rises above the horizon and the darkness seems to last forever. I had landed in the village around 2 in the afternoon, which was about an hour before full darkness would set in. The temperature was sitting at negative 42 degrees, cold enough that you could feel your nose hairs freeze when you breathed in, cold enough that exposed skin would get frostbite in less than 5 minutes. And the ice fog had rolled in that morning, thick and impenetrable, reducing the entire village to a white blur. I had delivered my supplies and was preparing to leave, wanting to get back to Fairbanks before the weather deteriorated further, when the village elder approached me. His name was Joseph, a man in his 70s, who had lived in that village his entire life and who commanded respect from everyone who knew him. He told me I should not try to fly out until the ice fog lifted, that it was too dangerous and that I should wait it out in the village. I explained that I had flown through worse conditions, that my instruments could handle it. But he shook his head and said something that made me pause. He said the ice fog was not the danger, that there were other things in the fog that I needed to be careful of. I asked him what he meant, and he hesitated before telling me about the children. He said that sometimes, when the ice fog comes and the temperature drops below -40, people see children playing in the fog, children with no coats, no boots, no protection from the cold, children who should not be able to survive in those conditions, but who appear anyway, laughing and playing as if it is a warm summer day. He said the children are not dangerous exactly, but that they lead people astray, lead them away from safety and into the fog where they can become lost and freeze to death. He told me that if I saw them, I should not follow them, should not try to help them, should just turn around and walk away. I did not believe him. I thought he was telling me a local legend, a story meant to scare outsiders, or to explain why people sometimes got disoriented and lost in the ice fog. I thanked him for the warning, told him I would be careful, and decided to stay the night in the village rather than risk flying in those conditions. Joseph offered me a place to sleep in the community hall, and I accepted, planning to leave first thing in the morning when visibility would hopefully improve. Around 8 that evening, I went outside to check on my plane to make sure the engine cover was secure and that everything was properly winterized for the night. The ice fog was even thicker than it had been earlier, so dense that I could barely see my hand in front of my face. The village was silent, that unnatural silence that ice fog creates, and the only light came from the occasional window glowing yellow in the white darkness. I walked slowly toward where I had parked my plane, using a flashlight to navigate, feeling my way more than seeing. That is when I heard them, children laughing, high-pitched and clear, the sound of kids playing some game that only they understood. I stopped walking and stood perfectly still, listening, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. The laughter seemed to move through the fog, coming from one direction and then another, echoing in a way that should not have been possible, given how sound-dampening ice fog is. I called out, asking if anyone was there, asking if the kids were okay. The laughter stopped for a moment, and then I heard footsteps, small footsteps running through the snow. I turned my flashlight in the direction of the sound and saw them. 3 children, maybe between the ages of 7 and 10, standing about 20 feet away from me in the ice fog. They were wearing thin clothes, summer clothes, t-shirts, and pants with no coats or hats or gloves. Their feet were bare, standing in snow. That was several inches deep. And they were smiling at me, waving, beckoning for me to come closer. My first instinct was panic. Children were outside in -40-degree weather with no protection, and they were going to freeze to death if I did not get them inside immediately. I started walking toward them, calling out that they needed to come with me, that they needed to get warm. But as I got closer, they started moving away, staying just out of reach, still smiling, still waving. They moved through the ice fog as if they could see perfectly, as if they knew exactly where they were going, and I followed them without thinking about what I was doing. We walked for what felt like several minutes, moving away from the village, moving into an area where there were no houses or lights. The children stayed ahead of me, just visible through the fog, their laughter echoing around me. And then something made me stop. I don't know what it was exactly. Maybe some survival instinct, maybe the memory of Joseph's warning, but I suddenly realized that I had no idea where I was. I turned around trying to see the village lights behind me, but there was nothing except white fog in every direction. I'd walked away from safety, had followed these children into the wilderness, and I was completely lost. I turned back to where the children had been, planning to yell at them to stop, to demand that they tell me how to get back to the village. But when I looked at them, really looked at them for the first time, I understood. Their skin was not the healthy pink of living children. It was blue-tinged, the color of frostbite and hypothermia. Their eyes were too dark, too empty, like looking into holes rather than human faces, and their feet, bare in the snow, were not leaving any footprints. The snow where they stood was completely undisturbed, as if they weighed nothing, as if they were not really there at all. I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The children stopped smiling. They all raised their arms at the same time and pointed behind me, pointing back in the direction I'd come from. And then they simply faded away, dissolving into the ice fog as if they had never existed. I ran. I ran through that fog in the direction they had pointed, stumbling over uneven ground, falling twice in the snow, not caring about anything except getting away from where I had seen them. I do not know how long I ran, but eventually I saw lights ahead of me, the warm yellow glow of the village buildings. I made it back to the community hall and collapsed inside, shaking from cold and fear and shock. Joseph was there, sitting by the wood stove, and he looked at me with an expression that said he already knew what had happened. I told him what I had seen, described the children in detail, asked him what they were. He was quiet for a long time before he answered. He said the children died during the influenza epidemic of 1918, a pandemic that killed millions of people worldwide and devastated native Alaskan communities. In his village, over half the population died in just a few weeks, including most of the children. They were buried in a mass grave on the outskirts of the village, but according to the elders, their spirits never left. They appear every few years when the ice fog comes, playing in the cold that killed them, leading people away from safety, perhaps as a game or perhaps as a warning. No one really knows. Joseph said the children had saved my life by pointing me back toward the village. He said they could have let me wander until I froze to death, but instead they had shown me the way home. He said I should consider myself lucky, that not everyone who sees the children makes it back. I have seen them twice more since that first encounter, both times during ice fog in interior villages. The second time was about a year later in a different village, and the third time was just last winter in the same village where I first saw them. Both times they appeared while I was outside checking on my plane. Both times they beckoned for me to follow them, and both times they pointed me back toward safety after I refused. I do not follow them anymore. I have learned to recognize them for what they are, spirits, or ghosts, or whatever name you want to give to the dead who refuse to rest. I still fly cargo runs to that village, still deliver supplies twice a month, still land my plane on frozen airstrips in the middle of nowhere. But I refuse cargo runs during ice fog season now, refuse to be in those villages when the temperature drops below -40 and the fog rolls in. The other pilots think I am superstitious, think I am letting local legends affect my business decisions. But I know what I saw, and I know that some warnings should be taken seriously, especially in Alaska, where the line between the living and the dead seems thinner than it does anywhere else. There are certain dates that become etched in your memory, dates that divide your life into before and after. And for me and everyone else in my town, that date is Christmas Eve 2019. I am the volunteer fire chief in a small Alaskan town of about 300 people, a position I have held for 12 years. In a community this size, everyone volunteers for something because there are not enough people or resources to have full-time emergency services. We have volunteer firefighters, volunteer emergency medical technicians, and volunteer search and rescue personnel. We train together, we drill together, and we pray that we never have to respond to anything more serious than a small kitchen fire or a medical emergency that can be stabilized until the medevac helicopter arrives. Christmas has always been special in our town. Despite the cold and the darkness of winter, or perhaps because of it, people decorate their homes with thousands of lights, transforming our little community into something magical. Every house participates, every family contributes, and the result is a display of warmth and hope that pushes back against the long Alaskan night. On Christmas Eve, we hold a service at the community church, the only church in town, where everyone gathers, regardless of their particular religious beliefs. It is less about theology and more about community, about coming together during the darkest time of year to remind ourselves that we are not alone. The Miller family had lived in our town for 8 years. Isabella and her husband had moved up from Oregon with their 2 children, a boy and a girl, who were 7 and 9 years old at the time it happened. They were good people, the kind of family that everyone liked. Isabella volunteered at the school. Her husband worked as a mechanic and helped anyone who needed their snowmobile or truck repaired, and their kids were polite and friendly. They lived in a modest house on the eastern edge of town, a 2-story structure they had purchased when they first arrived and had slowly been fixing up over the years. They were particularly enthusiastic about Christmas, always among the first to put up their decorations and among the last to take them down. Christmas Eve 2019 was bitterly cold, with temperatures hovering around -20 degrees and a light snow falling that made everything look like a scene from a postcard. The church service started at 7 in the evening, and nearly everyone in town attended. The Miller family sat 3 rows ahead of me, the children restless with excitement about Christmas morning, Isabella smiling as she tried to keep them calm. The service lasted about an hour, filled with familiar carols and a short sermon about hope and community. Afterwards, families exchanged greetings, made plans for Christmas dinner, and slowly dispersed into the night, heading home to their warm houses and their waiting traditions. I got home around 9, had a late dinner with my wife, and was preparing to go to bed when my radio crackled to life. It was 2 in the morning, and the voice on the other end was panicked, barely coherent. Fire at the Miller house, flames visible from the road, family might still be inside. I was out of bed and dressed in less than a minute, calling the other volunteer firefighters as I ran to my truck. By the time I arrived at the scene 3 minutes later, the house was already fully engulfed. Fire moves fast in cold weather, especially in older wooden structures. But this was something beyond what I had ever seen. The entire house was burning with an intensity that suggested accelerant, flames shooting from every window, the roof beginning to collapse inward. 3 of my firefighters were already there, and more were arriving every few seconds, but we all knew we were too late to save the structure. Our only hope was that the family had gotten out. They had. Isabella and her husband and their 2 children were standing in the snow about 50 yards from the house, wrapped in blankets that neighbors had brought them, watching their home burn. They were alive, and that was what mattered. But the look on Isabella's face was one of pure shock and confusion. I approached them as soon as I confirmed my team had the fire under control, asked if everyone was okay, if anyone needed medical attention. Isabella's husband said they were fine physically, that they had woken to the smell of smoke and had managed to get out through a window because the stairs were already blocked by flames. We fought that fire for 3 hours before we finally got it under control. By then, there was nothing left but a blackened skeleton of what had been their home. Everything they owned was gone, reduced to ash and twisted metal. The community rallied immediately, offering the Miller family a place to stay, bringing them clothes and toiletries and food, doing what small communities do when one of their own suffers a tragedy. But beneath the sympathy and the support, there was an undercurrent of fear because what we discovered in the days following the fire changed everything. The fire investigator arrived from Anchorage 3 days after Christmas. He spent 2 full days sifting through the debris, taking samples, photographing what remained, and interviewing everyone involved. His report, when it finally came, confirmed what we had all suspected. but hoped was not true. The fire had been deliberately set. Accelerant had been poured along the base of the walls inside the house. Multiple ignition points had been identified, and the pattern of burn marks indicated that whoever set it had intended for the house to burn quickly and completely. This was not an accident. This was arson. And given that the family had been inside and asleep, it was attempted murder. The Alaska State Troopers took over the investigation, treating it as a criminal case rather than just a fire incident. They interviewed everyone in town, asked about any conflicts or disputes involving the Miller family, looked into their background for anyone who might have had a motive to hurt them. They found nothing. Isabella and her husband had no enemies, no one they had argued with, no financial troubles that might have motivated someone to target them. They were just a normal family, living a quiet life in a small town where everyone knew everyone else. But then the troopers discovered something that made the case even more disturbing. For 3 weeks before the fire, the Miller family had been receiving threats. Anonymous notes left on their doorstep, tucked under their windshield wipers, slipped through the mail slot. The notes contained messages like, "You are not wanted here," and "Leave before something bad happens," and "Your family is in danger." Isabella had kept all of the notes, had been planning to report them to the troopers after Christmas, but had not thought they were serious enough to warrant immediate action. In a town where everyone knows everyone, who would be leaving anonymous threats? The handwriting on the notes was analyzed, compared against writing samples from everyone in town who agreed to provide them. No matches were found. The paper and ink were generic brands available at any store, offering no clues about who might have purchased them. The timing of when the notes appeared gave no pattern that could be traced to any specific person's schedule or movements. And on Christmas Eve, when the fire was set, everyone in town had an alibi. We had all been at the church service together, all visible and accounted for until after 9 in the evening. The fire had been set sometime between 1 and 2 in the morning. But in a town this small, where everyone knows the sound of a vehicle driving past their house, no one had heard anything unusual. The investigation stretched on for months. Forensic experts examined the accelerant used, tracing it to a common brand of lamp oil that dozens of households in our area kept on hand for emergencies when power went out. They looked into the possibility that the fire had been set on a timer, though they found no evidence of any device. They considered the possibility that someone from outside the town had targeted the Miller family, though there was no indication of how an outsider would have known where they lived or how to navigate our town in the dark without being noticed. The case remains unsolved. The Alaska State Troopers keep it open, officially listed as attempted murder and arson with an unknown perpetrator. The Miller family moved away 3 months after the fire, unable to stay in a place where someone had tried to kill them and where that someone was still walking free, possibly living among us. They sent a letter to the community a few weeks after they left, thanking everyone for the support, but explaining that they could not raise their children in a town where they no longer felt safe. I do not blame them. If I had been in their position, I would have done the same thing. What haunts me most about this case is not just that it happened, but that it means someone in my town, someone I know, someone I see regularly, is capable of this kind of violence. We all have our suspicions, our theories about who might have done it and why, but without evidence, they remain just speculation. I have installed security cameras around my own home, something that used to be unnecessary in a place where everyone trusts their neighbors. My wife and I sleep less soundly than we used to, jumping at unexpected sounds, checking locks multiple times before going to bed. The town has changed since that Christmas Eve. People are more guarded, less trusting, more aware that the safety we thought we had was always somewhat of an illusion. We still celebrate Christmas, still decorate our houses, still gather at the church on Christmas Eve. But there is a shadow over the celebration now, a reminder that something evil exists among us, something that was willing to burn a family alive while they slept on the holiest night of the year. I think about Isabella and her family often, wonder where they ended up, hope they have found someplace where they can feel safe again. And I think about whoever set that fire, about the fact that they are still out there, still living their life as if nothing happened. The worst part about an unsolved crime is not just the lack of justice. It is the knowledge that the person responsible is still among us, still pretending to be normal, still hiding in plain sight. And until they are caught, none of us can truly feel safe again. I have worked for the Alaska Department of Transportation for 19 years, and in that time I have driven every major highway in the state, maintained roads through some of the most remote and unforgiving terrain in North America, and dealt with conditions that would make most people question their sanity. Avalanches, permafrost heaves, wildlife crossings, you name it, I've seen it. But nothing in my nearly 2 decades of experience prepared me for what has been happening on Highway 17, the 200-mile stretch of road that connects the villages of Ketchum and North Point in the interior. The road is disappearing, not collapsing, not eroding, but actually shrinking, as if the land itself is folding in on itself and taking the highway with it. Highway 17 is one of the lonelier roads in Alaska, which is saying something considering how many isolated highways we have. It was built in the 1970s to provide a land connection between 2 villages that had previously relied entirely on air transport and river barges. The road cuts through dense boreal forest, crosses 3 major rivers, and winds through terrain that remains frozen for 8 months of the year. Traffic is minimal, maybe 20 vehicles per day during summer and fewer than 5 during winter. My job is to drive the route once a week during the warmer months and once every 2 weeks during winter, checking for damage, clearing debris, and making sure the mile markers and road signs are intact. I know this road better than I know the layout of my own house. I can tell you where every turn is, every bridge, every landmark. At mile marker 47, there's a distinctive lightning-struck spruce tree that stands alone in a clearing. At mile 52, there's an old trapper's cabin, about 100 yards off the road, abandoned for decades but still structurally sound. At mile 63, the road crosses Eagle River on a steel bridge that was installed in 1981. I have been driving this route for 12 years, and until 2 years ago, it never changed. Roads do not change. They might deteriorate, they might require maintenance, but their fundamental geography remains constant. It started in the spring of 2023. I was making my weekly run, driving north from Ketchum toward North Point, when I noticed that mile marker 47 was missing. Not knocked down, not vandalized, just gone. There was no sign of the post, no hole in the ground where it should have been, nothing to indicate it had ever existed. I made a note to report it when I got back to town, assuming it had been removed for some reason or had been stolen, though who would steal a mile marker from the middle of nowhere is beyond me. The following week, mile marker 46 was gone, then 45, then 44. Over the course of 6 weeks, I watched as the mile markers along a 10-mile stretch of highway simply vanished, one by one, working backwards from 47. I reported it to my supervisor, who authorized me to install replacement markers. But when I went out with new posts and a post hole digger, I could not figure out where to put them. My GPS showed that I was at the correct coordinates for where mile marker 47 should be. But when I looked at the landmarks around me, I was clearly at what should have been mile 43. The lightning-struck spruce tree, which should have been at 47, was now showing up at 43 on my GPS. The trapper's cabin, which should have been at 52, was now at 48. I thought my GPS was malfunctioning. I checked it against 2 backup units and my phone, and they all showed the same thing. The coordinates were correct, but the physical landmarks had moved. Or rather, the road had shortened. The distance between Ketchum and the lightning-struck tree used to be 47 miles. Now it was 43. The landmarks had not moved, The road between them had somehow compressed. I reported this to my supervisor, trying to explain what I was seeing, and he sent out a survey crew to verify the measurements. They spent 3 days resurveying the entire highway, using professional-grade equipment, and their findings confirmed what I had been seeing. The road was shorter than it used to be. Not by a lot, but by enough to be measurable and inexplicable. Highway 17, which had been 203 miles long according to the original survey documents from 1976, was now 197 miles long. 6 miles of road had simply disappeared. The survey crew could not explain it. There had been no seismic activity in the area, no landslides or sinkholes that might have altered the terrain. The bridges were all intact and in their original positions. The landmarks that I had been using as reference points were exactly where they had always been, in relation to each other. But the road connecting them was shorter. It was as if someone had taken a map, cut out a section, and then taped the remaining pieces back together, shrinking the total distance without moving any of the individual features. My supervisor contacted the University of Alaska to see if they could send geologists to investigate. A team of 3 researchers arrived in late summer and spent 2 weeks studying the area. They used ground-penetrating radar, took core samples, set up monitoring stations to detect any ground movement, and interviewed local residents about whether they had noticed anything unusual. Their final report, which I was allowed to read, concluded that there was no geological explanation for what was happening. The bedrock was stable. There was no indication of subsidence or tectonic activity, and the permafrost in the area had not shifted in any way that would account for the road's apparent compression. One of the geologists suggested that perhaps the original survey from 1976 had been wrong, that the road had always been 197 miles long, and the error was in the historical records, but that did not explain the missing mile markers, which had been installed according to measured distances, and which I had personally verified for over a decade. It also did not explain what happened next. The road kept shrinking. Throughout the fall and winter of 2023, I continued my maintenance runs, and each time the distance between landmarks grew shorter. The trapper's cabin, which had been at mile 48 after the first compression, was at mile 46 by November, then at mile 44 by January. The Eagle River Bridge, which should have been at mile 63, appeared at mile 59, then at mile 56. By the spring of 2024, Highway 17 was only 183 miles long. 20 miles of road had vanished in less than a year. Driving the route became increasingly surreal. I would leave Ketchum in the morning, pass landmarks in an order that my memory said was correct, but arrive at destinations far sooner than I should have. The trip that used to take me 4.5 hours now took 3.5 hours, even though I was driving at the same speed. My odometer showed fewer miles traveled than it should have. My GPS insisted that I was at locations that did not match what I was seeing out my windshield. Other drivers started reporting the phenomenon as well. Truckers who regularly hauled supplies between the 2 villages complained that their fuel consumption did not match the distance they were supposed to be covering. Local residents said that trips that used to take all day were now taking significantly less time. One man told me he had been counting trees along a specific section of road for years as a way to pass the time, and that the number of trees had decreased even though none had been cut down or fallen. The Alaska Department of Transportation eventually made the decision to remove all remaining mile markers from Highway 17 and to stop using mile-based references for the route. Instead, they issued guidance to use landmark-based directions and to rely on GPS coordinates rather than distance measurements. But even the GPS coordinates were becoming unreliable. Features that showed up at certain coordinates one week would show up at different coordinates the next week, as if the underlying geography was fluid rather than fixed. I requested a meeting with my supervisor and several state officials to discuss what was happening and whether the road should be closed, pending further investigation. They listened to my concerns, but ultimately decided that since there was no obvious safety hazard, no structural damage to the road itself, and no explanation for what was causing the phenomenon, there was no justification for closing one of the few land routes between those two villages. People depended on that highway, and without it they would be back to relying entirely on expensive air transport. So I continued to drive Highway 17 once a week, watching as it slowly disappears beneath my wheels. As of last month, the road is 171 miles long, down from its original 203. 32 miles have vanished in just under 2 years. The landmarks I used to navigate by are still there, the spruce tree and the cabin and the bridges, but they are now clustered closer together than they should be, as if the space between them is collapsing. I've stopped trying to understand it. I've accepted that I am driving through some kind of geographical anomaly that defies conventional physics. The geologists cannot explain it, the surveyors cannot measure it accurately, and the state officials cannot decide what to do about it. All I know is that every week the drive gets a little shorter, the landmarks come a little faster, and the road continues to shrink in a way that should not be possible. The most disturbing part is not knowing when or if it will stop. Will Highway 17 continue to compress until the two villages are directly adjacent to each other with no road in between? Will the landmarks eventually merge into a single point? Or will the process reverse itself, stretching the road back to its original length or beyond? I have no answers, only questions that grow more urgent with each passing week. I keep detailed logs of every trip, noting landmarks and their positions, recording times and distances, documenting everything I see in case it is useful to someone someday. But I no longer trust my own measurements, no longer believe that the world operates according to the rules I thought were fixed and immutable. Highway 17 is teaching me that reality is more fluid than I ever imagined, and that there are places in Alaska where the normal laws of space and distance simply do not apply. I drive that road once a week, and every time I wonder if this will be the trip where it finally makes sense, where some explanation reveals itself. But it never does. The road keeps shrinking, the miles keep disappearing, and I keep driving through a landscape that refuses to stay still. I moved to Alaska for the same reason a lot of people do. I wanted to escape. I had been working in corporate marketing in Seattle, spending 12 hours a day in an office under fluorescent lights, and I had reached a point where I could not do it anymore. I wanted something different, something authentic, something that felt real. So when I saw a listing for an old boarding house in a former gold rush town, population 45 year-round residents, I sold everything I owned, withdrew my savings, and moved north without looking back. I planned to renovate the building and turn it into a bed and breakfast, catering to the handful of tourists who made the trek to see what was left of Alaska's gold rush history. It seemed like a good idea at the time. I did not know about James Anderson, the miner who died in that building over a century ago and who apparently never left. The town, which I will not name because I still own the property and do not need people showing up looking for ghosts, was established in 1902 during the height of Alaska's gold rush. At its peak, the population reached nearly 3,000 people, with dozens of mining operations running day and night. But like most gold rush towns, the easy gold ran out quickly, and by 1920, the population had dwindled to a few hundred. Today, it exists primarily as a tourist attraction, with a handful of preserved buildings, a small museum, and residents who make their living either from tourism or from working in Fairbanks 90 miles away. The boarding house I purchased was built in 1903 to house miners who worked the claims in the surrounding hills. It was a 3-story wooden structure with 8 small bedrooms, a communal dining area, and a large basement where miners would store their equipment and sometimes conduct preliminary sorting of ore. The building had been abandoned since the 1970s, and when I bought it, it was in rough shape but structurally sound. I spent my first 3 months just cleaning, removing decades of accumulated dirt and debris, repairing windows, and making the place habitable. The basement was the worst part of the renovation. It was dark, damp, and filled with old mining equipment that previous owners had never bothered to remove. There were rusted pickaxes, broken lanterns, ore buckets with holes in the bottom, and piles of rock samples that someone had apparently been testing for gold content. I considered clearing everything out and turning the basement into storage space, but ultimately decided to leave most of the equipment in place and incorporate it into the historical character of the building. Tourists would probably find it interesting. I opened the bed and breakfast in May of 2023, 6 months after I purchased the property. Business was slow at first, just a few guests here and there, mostly older couples interested in Alaska history. But then the report started. Guests would come down to breakfast and mention that they had seen a man in old-fashioned mining clothes standing in their room during the night. They described him as middle-aged, wearing canvas pants held up with suspenders, a flannel shirt, and heavy boots caked with mud. He would stand near the window or at the foot of the bed, not moving, not speaking, just staring at them. And then he would vanish, simply fading away, as if he had never been there. The first few times this happened, I assumed guests were having vivid dreams or were letting the historical atmosphere of the building affect their imagination. But when the 5th guest reported seeing the same man, described in nearly identical detail, I started to wonder if there was something more going on. I asked some of the long-time residents in town if they had ever heard stories about the boarding house being haunted. Most of them laughed it off, but one elderly woman who had lived in the town her entire life told me I should look into the history of James Anderson. According to local records, which I spent a week researching in the town's small historical society, James Anderson was a miner from Scotland who came to Alaska in 1902. He worked various claims around the area, never striking it rich, but making enough to survive. He lived in my boarding house from 1903 until his disappearance in 1905. Disappearance, not death. According to the newspaper accounts from that time, Anderson went missing one night in February. His fellow boarders reported that he had gone to the basement to retrieve some equipment and had never come back upstairs. They searched for him but found nothing. His belongings remained in his room, his wages from the previous week were still in his pocket, and his mining claim paperwork was on his bed. He had simply vanished. There were suspicions at the time that he had been murdered. Several miners had accused him of stealing gold from a shared claim, and tensions had been high in the weeks before his disappearance. But without a body or any evidence of foul play, no charges were ever filed. The case went cold, and James Anderson became just another name in the long list of people who disappeared during the chaotic gold rush era. After learning this history, I started paying more attention to what my guests were reporting. The man they were seeing matched the general description of miners from that time period. And there was one detail that kept appearing in their accounts. He was always dripping water, not wet clothes, but actual water dripping from his body, pooling on the floor beneath him. One guest said the water looked strange, almost frozen, with ice crystals forming where it hit the ground. I saw him for the first time in October, about 5 months after I opened the bed and breakfast. I was alone in the building, working late in the office I had set up in what used to be the dining room. It was around midnight when the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, going from comfortable to frigid in a matter of seconds. I could see my breath fogging in the air, and frost began forming on the windows despite the heater running. And then I saw him standing in the doorway to the basement. He looked exactly as my guests had described. Middle-aged, weathered face, wearing mining clothes that looked over a century old. But what struck me most was his expression. He looked desperate, almost pleading, as if he was trying to communicate something, but could not find the words. Ice water dripped from his hair, from his clothes, from his outstretched fingers, pooling on the floor in puddles that should not have been possible. Where he stood, frost spread across the floorboards in intricate patterns, like someone had painted them with ice. He raised his right hand and pointed at the floor beneath him, at the doorway to the basement. He pointed with an urgency that suggested this was important, that I needed to understand what he was trying to tell me. And then he vanished, fading away like smoke, leaving behind only the pools of ice-cold water and the frost patterns on the floor. I stood there shaking, not from cold, but from the reality of what I had just witnessed. I had seen a ghost, not a shadow, not something I could rationalize away, but a full apparition standing 10 feet away from me. And he had been trying to tell me something, pointing at the basement floor as if something important was down there. I called the local police the next morning and told them I wanted to excavate part of my basement floor. They asked why, and I told them about the history of James Anderson, about the reports from my guests, about what I had seen. The officer I spoke with was skeptical, but agreed to send someone out. They brought ground-penetrating radar and scanned the basement floor where James had been pointing. The scan showed an anomaly, something dense, buried about 4 feet below the surface. With permission from the town's Historical Preservation Board, I hired a contractor to carefully excavate that section of the basement. We worked slowly, documenting everything, treating it like an archaeological dig. 3 feet down, we found them. Human remains, partially mummified by the cold and dry conditions, sealed in what had clearly been a deliberate burial. Along with the remains were mining tools, a leather pouch containing personal effects, and identification papers that confirmed what I already suspected. It was James Anderson. The remains were turned over to the Alaska State Medical Examiner, who determined that Anderson had died from blunt force trauma to the skull. He had been murdered, just as people had suspected in 1905, and his body had been hidden beneath the basement floor where no one thought to look. The case was officially closed as a historical homicide with no viable suspects, given that anyone involved would have been dead for over a century. I arranged for James Anderson to be given a proper burial in the town cemetery, with a headstone marking his name and the dates of his life and death. About 30 people attended the service, mostly locals who were interested in the town's history and who felt that Anderson deserved a respectful farewell after being hidden for so long. After the burial, the sighting stopped. Guests no longer reported seeing a man in mining clothes in their rooms. The temperature drops ceased. The unexplained water and frost patterns disappeared. The boarding house felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. I thought that was the end of it. The James Anderson had finally found peace and moved on. But every winter, when the temperatures drop below zero and frost forms naturally on the windows, I see something that makes me think he is still watching. The frost patterns on my windows are never random. They form shapes, deliberate patterns that look like a man pointing downward, reminding me of what was found in the basement. Sometimes I stand at those windows and trace the patterns with my finger, and I tell James that I remember him, that his story is no longer forgotten, that he finally got the justice and the burial he deserved. I still run the bed and breakfast, and I tell every guest who stays here about James Anderson, about how he disappeared and how he was found. The story has actually increased my bookings, with people specifically requesting the rooms where he was most often seen. I find comfort in knowing that even though he suffered a violent death and was hidden away for over a century, James Anderson's spirit was strong enough to reach across time and tell someone where to look, and I'm grateful that I was the one who listened. I served as an Alaska State Trooper for 23 years, and in that time I saw just about every kind of crime and tragedy you can imagine. Domestic violence, calls in villages accessible only by plane, search and rescue operations in terrain that could kill you in a dozen different ways. Investigations into deaths that were sometimes accidents and sometimes something far more sinister. I thought I had seen it all, thought nothing could surprise me anymore. But what happened to Trooper James Anderson 3 years ago has haunted me in ways that none of my other cases ever did, because it proved that even law enforcement officers are not immune to the darkness that exists in remote Alaska. I retired 5 years ago from active duty, but I still live in the same district I served for 2 decades, a region that covers approximately 8,000 square miles and includes 4 small villages with a combined population of about 600 people. When I retired, they brought in Anderson to replace me. He was young, maybe 27 or 28, fresh from the academy and eager to make a difference. He had that idealistic energy that young troopers often have, the belief that they can solve problems that others have given up on, that they can bring justice to places where justice has been absent for too long. I met Anderson a few times during his first months on the job. He would stop by my house occasionally to ask questions about the area, about the people, about how to navigate the complex social dynamics of small, isolated communities where everyone is related to everyone else and where outsiders are viewed with suspicion. I gave him what advice I could, warned him about getting too involved in cases that had been cold for years, told him that some mysteries in rural Alaska are never going to be solved no matter how much effort you put into them. He listened politely, but I could tell he thought I was just a tired old cop who had given up. He was determined to do better. About 6 months into his assignment, Anderson became obsessed with a cold case from my files. It involved a missing person from 15 years ago, a woman named Sarah who had disappeared from one of the villages under circumstances that were never explained. She'd been a teacher at the village school, well liked by everyone, with no apparent reason to leave and no history of mental health issues or substance abuse. One day, she simply did not show up for work, and when people went to check on her, her cabin was empty. Her truck was parked outside. Her belongings were all in place, but Sarah was gone. We searched for weeks, interviewed everyone in the village, followed every lead we could find. We found nothing. No body, no evidence of foul play, no indication of where she might have gone. Eventually, the case went cold, and Sarah became one of the many people who disappear in Alaska every year without explanation. Anderson believed the case could still be solved. He spent his off-duty hours going through the old files, re-interviewing people I had talked to years ago, looking for inconsistencies or details that might have been overlooked. He became convinced that Sarah had been murdered and that someone in the village knew what had happened to her. He told me this during one of his visits, said he was getting close to figuring it out, that he had a witness who was ready to talk. I asked him who the witness was, and he said he could not tell me yet, that he needed to meet with them first and get their statement on record. That was the last conversation I had with him. 2 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, Anderson radio dispatched to say he was meeting with a witness regarding the Sarah case. He gave his location, a remote section of road about 20 miles outside the largest village in the district. He said he would check in again within the hour. He never did. When Anderson failed to check in, dispatch tried to raise him on the radio. No response. They called his cell phone. No answer. After 2 hours of silence, they contacted me and asked if I would drive out to his last known location to check on him. I agreed immediately, that instinctive dread already settling in my stomach, the feeling that something had gone very wrong. I found his patrol vehicle exactly where he had said he would be, pulled off to the side of the road near a turnout that overlooked a small creek. The vehicle was running, engine still on, driver's door standing open. His radio was on, tuned to the correct frequency. His cell phone was in the cup holder between the seats. His service weapon was in its holster on the passenger seat, which immediately struck me as wrong, because troopers do not take off their weapons unless they are in a secure location. His laptop was open on the dashboard, still powered on, with his case notes displayed on the screen, but Anderson was gone. I called his name, searched the immediate area, looked for any sign of where he might have gone. There were no footprints leading away from the vehicle, no signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing that indicated violence or an altercation. It was as if he had simply stepped out of his patrol car and vanished into the air. I called for backup, and within hours, we had a full search and rescue operation underway. Troopers came in from other districts. Volunteers from the villages joined the effort, and we had helicopters searching from the air, and teams on the ground covering every inch of terrain within a 5-mile radius. We searched for 3 days, expanding the search area each day but found nothing. No clothing, no equipment, no trace that Anderson had ever walked through those woods. The investigation that followed was extensive. Detectives interviewed everyone in all 4 villages, asking about Anderson's activities in the weeks before he disappeared, trying to identify who the witness was that he had planned to meet. They reviewed his case files, his notes, his phone records, his emails. They examined his patrol vehicle for evidence, looking for anything that might explain what had happened. They found nothing useful. The witness he was supposed to meet denied any knowledge of an appointment. In fact, everyone who had been interviewed in connection with the Sarah case claimed they had not been in contact with Anderson recently, had not agreed to meet with him, had no idea what he was talking about. Someone was lying, but without evidence, we could not determine who. Anderson's notes on his laptop indicated that he had made significant progress on the Sarah case. He had written that he believed he knew who was responsible for her disappearance, and that the witness he was meeting would provide the final piece of evidence needed to make an arrest. But he had not written the name of the suspect or the witness, perhaps out of caution, perhaps because he was still gathering information. Whatever his reasoning, that decision meant we had no way of knowing who he was meeting or who might have had a motive to harm him. The case remains unsolved. Trooper James Anderson has been missing for 3 years. He is listed as a missing person, and technically the case is still active, but everyone who worked on it knows the truth. Anderson is almost certainly dead, murdered by someone who did not want him solving the Sarah case, someone who had managed to lure him to a remote location and then make him disappear just as thoroughly as Sarah had disappeared 15 years earlier. What haunts me most is the knowledge that someone in one of these villages is responsible. The population is small enough that it has to be someone I know, someone I probably talked to during the original investigation into Sarah's disappearance, someone who has been living among us all this time, and that person was clever enough and ruthless enough to eliminate a state trooper and leave no evidence behind. I drive past the spot where Anderson's vehicle was found every few weeks. There's nothing there now to indicate what happened, just a stretch of gravel road beside a creek in the middle of nowhere. But I think about him every time. Think about how he was so determined to solve a case that I had given up on, and how that determination cost him everything. I wonder if Sarah is buried somewhere in these woods, and if Anderson is buried near her, 2 victims of the same killer separated by 15 years. The state assigned a new trooper to the district, a more experienced officer who knows better than to dig into cold cases without backup. The villages have gone back to their normal routines, though I notice people are more careful now, more aware that law enforcement officers are not invincible. And I watch everyone more carefully than I used to, trying to see behind their faces, trying to figure out which of my neighbors is capable of murder. I will probably never know the truth about what happened to Anderson, just like I will never know what happened to Sarah. Alaska has a way of keeping its secrets, of swallowing people whole and never giving them back. But I keep watching, keep listening, keep hoping that someday someone will make a mistake, will say something they should not have known, will give me some indication of who is responsible. Until then, I live with the knowledge that evil walks among us, hiding in plain sight in a place where everyone knows everyone, and that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us become victims themselves. I have worked as a radio technician for the Alaska Rural Communications Service for 11 years, maintaining and repairing the communication equipment that remote villages depend on for survival. In a state where vast distances, extreme weather, and rugged terrain make travel difficult or impossible for much of the year, radio communication is not just a convenience, but a lifeline. when someone has a medical emergency in a village 300 miles from the nearest hospital, when a fire breaks out and volunteer firefighters need coordination, when storms isolate communities for weeks at a time, radio is what keeps people connected to the outside world and to each other. My job is to make sure those connections stay operational, which means I spend a lot of time traveling to places most people have never heard of, troubleshooting equipment in conditions that range from uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous. 3 years ago, I started receiving interference reports from multiple villages across the interior region. Operators were complaining about a low-frequency signal that was disrupting their emergency channels, making it difficult to transmit and receive clear communications. The signal was not constant, but would appear at irregular intervals, sometimes lasting for hours, sometimes only minutes. It was described as rhythmic, almost pulsing, with a pattern that suggested intentionality rather than random electronic noise. Several operators thought it might be some kind of code, perhaps old military transmission or an automated weather station malfunctioning, but no one could identify the source or decode the pattern. I spent 2 weeks driving between villages with a directional antenna and signal analyzer, trying to triangulate where the interference was coming from. The work was tedious and frustrating because the signal would appear and disappear without warning, making it difficult to get accurate readings. But slowly, over dozens of measurements taken at different locations and different times, a pattern emerged. The signal was strongest in a specific region about 100 miles northwest of Fairbanks, an area of dense boreal forest with no villages, no roads, and no known infrastructure except for a handful of abandoned military installations from the Cold War era. I narrowed the source down to a specific set of coordinates that corresponded to a decommissioned Air Force facility that had been closed since 1982. The facility had been part of the distant Early Warning Line, a network of radar stations built during the Cold War to detect incoming Soviet bombers. When the facility was decommissioned, the radar equipment was removed or destroyed, the buildings were sealed, and the site was officially abandoned. According to military records, there was no power to the facility, no active equipment, and no reason for anything there to be transmitting any kind of signal. I reported my findings to my supervisor, who authorized an expedition to investigate. He assigned another technician named Michael to accompany me, partly for safety reasons since traveling to remote locations in Alaska is inherently risky, and partly because he wanted a second opinion on what we found. We chartered a bush plane to fly us to the site since there were no roads within 50 miles of the coordinates. The pilot, a man in his 60s who had been flying in Alaska for decades, gave us a strange look when we told him where we wanted to go. He said he had flown over that area many times and had always noticed something off about it, though he could not explain exactly what. His instruments would act erratically when he flew nearby, his radio would fill with static, and he would get a feeling that he should stay away. But he agreed to take us, with the stipulation that he would only wait on the ground for 3 hours before leaving with or without us. The flight took about 45 minutes, and as we approached the coordinates, I noticed the interference in our radio communications increasing. The pilot's voice became distorted, overlaid with that rhythmic pulsing signal that had been reported by the village operators. It was unsettling hearing it firsthand, because it really did sound like it was trying to communicate something, like a message being repeated over and over in a language that made no sense. We landed on an overgrown airstrip that had not been maintained in over 40 years. The forest was reclaiming the facility, with saplings growing through cracks in the concrete and moss covering everything. The buildings were exactly as described in the decommissioning reports, sealed with heavy metal doors and boarded windows, their paint faded and peeling. There were 3 main structures: a radar operations building, a barracks, and a power station. All of them looked completely abandoned, with no signs of recent human activity. Michael and I approached the radar operations building first, using bolt cutters to remove the rusted chains that secured the door. Inside, it was dark and cold, smelling of mildew and decay. We used flashlights to navigate through rooms filled with old furniture, filing cabinets with drawers hanging open and walls covered in faded safety posters from the 1970s. In the main operations room, we found the source of the signal. Or rather, we found what should have been the source, except it made absolutely no sense. The old radar equipment was still there, covered in decades of dust and clearly non-functional. Wires had been cut during the decommissioning process, circuit boards had been removed, and anything valuable or sensitive had been stripped out. What remained was essentially junk, equipment that had not been operational in over 40 years. But my signal analyzer was going crazy, showing that an active transmission was coming from this room, specifically from the area where the old radar console sat. The signal strength was overwhelming at this proximity, and the rhythmic pattern was clearly audible through my equipment's speaker. I checked every possible explanation. I looked for hidden equipment, for any sign that someone had installed new transmitters or receivers. I checked for power sources, for batteries, or generators that might be providing electricity. I examined the building's wiring to see if somehow it was still connected to a grid. I found nothing. The facility had no power. The main breaker box showed that all circuits had been manually disconnected. There were no solar panels, no generators, no batteries large enough to power a transmission. And yet, undeniably, something in that room was broadcasting a signal strong enough to interfere with radio communications across hundreds of square miles. Michael was as baffled as I was. He had 30 years of experience with radio equipment, had worked on everything from simple handheld units to complex military-grade communication systems, and he had never seen anything like this. We spent 2 hours taking measurements, documenting everything with photographs and video, collecting samples of wire and components to analyze later. And then our 3 hours were up, and the pilot was radioing that he was leaving in 10 minutes, whether we were on the plane or not. We flew back to Fairbanks and immediately filed a report with our supervisor and with military authorities. The Air Force sent a team to investigate 2 weeks later, and their findings were identical to ours. No power source, no active equipment, no explanation for the signal. They brought in specialist electrical engineers and physicists who examined the site for several days. Their official report concluded that there was indeed a radio transmission originating from the facility, but that they could not determine how it was being generated. The report suggested the possibility of some kind of natural electromagnetic phenomenon, though it acknowledged that such a phenomenon would be unprecedented and not consistent with known physics. The most disturbing aspect of the entire situation is that the signal has never stopped. It continues to this day, transmitting on the same frequency, with the same rhythmic pattern, disrupting communications across the interior region. I have been back to the facility 6 times over the past 3 years, always hoping to find some new clue, some piece of evidence that would explain what is happening. Each time, I find the same thing: abandoned buildings with no power, equipment that should not be capable of transmitting anything, and a signal that defies explanation. I have recorded hours of the transmission and sent the recordings to cryptographers, to linguists, to anyone who might be able to decode it or recognize a pattern. No one has been successful. It is not Morse code, not binary, not any known encoding system. Some analysts have suggested it might be random noise that our brains are interpreting as patterns, but the consistency of the signal over years argues against that. Others have suggested it might be of natural origin, perhaps related to geological processes or atmospheric conditions unique to that location, but no one has been able to propose a mechanism that would explain it. The Air Force eventually classified the facility as a location of ongoing investigation and installed monitoring equipment to track the signal continuously. But they have made no progress in understanding it, and after 3 years, interest has waned. The official position is that it remains an unexplained phenomenon, possibly related to legacy military equipment interacting in unexpected ways with natural electromagnetic fields. But that explanation feels like giving up, like admitting we do not understand what is happening and choosing to stop trying. I continue to visit the facility annually, usually in summer, when access is easiest. I walk through those abandoned buildings, stand in the operations room where the signal is strongest, and listen to that rhythmic pulse that has been broadcasting without interruption for at least 3 years, and possibly much longer. I wonder if it was transmitting the whole time the facility was abandoned, from 1982 until we discovered it in 2022, 40 years of an unheard signal broadcasting into empty forest. I wonder what it is trying to say, if it is trying to say anything at all, or if it is just an artifact of technology we have forgotten how to understand. The villages have learned to work around the interference, adjusting their frequencies and scheduling their communications for times when the signal is weakest. Life goes on, as it always does, even when faced with things we cannot explain. But I think about that facility often, about equipment that transmits without power, about a signal that refuses to stop. And I know that somewhere in the Alaska wilderness, in a building that has been abandoned for over 40 years, something is still broadcasting, still trying to reach someone, still waiting for a response that may never come. I do not know how to explain what happened in my town without sounding like I have lost my mind, so I'm just going to tell you exactly what I saw and let you decide for yourself what it means. I have lived in the same fishing village on the southeastern coast of Alaska for my entire life, all 37 years of it. The population here hovers around 200 people, give or take a few dozen depending on the season, and whether the fishing is good or bad that year. This is the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else, where you do not lock your doors because there is no reason to, where a stranger walking down Main Street would be noticed and talked about within 5 minutes. We have one school, one church, one general store, and one diner. That diner is where this story begins, and it is where my sense of safety in this world ended. Her name was Emily, and she worked at the diner for as long as I can remember. She was not originally from here, having moved to our town about 15 years ago from somewhere in the lower 48, though she never talked much about where exactly or why she left. In a place like this, you learn not to pry too much into people's past because most folks who end up in remote Alaskan villages are running from something or looking for something they could not find anywhere else. Emily was kind, always had a smile for everyone who walked through that door, and she knew your order before you even sat down. She knew I took my coffee black with no sugar, that I always ordered the salmon scramble on Tuesdays, and that I liked to sit in the booth by the window where I could watch the harbor while I ate. Those small things matter in a town this size. They are what make you feel like you belong somewhere. About 3 months before she disappeared, Emily started acting different. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you might not notice if you were not paying attention, but I noticed because I went to that diner almost every morning before heading down to the docks. She seemed distracted, kept looking over her shoulder, like she expected someone to be standing there, and she started dropping things, which was not like her at all. One morning in late September, I asked her if everything was okay, and she hesitated before answering, which told me more than her words did. She said she had been receiving letters in her mailbox, letters with no return address and no postage stamp, which meant someone was hand-delivering them. She said the letters were not threatening exactly, but they made her uncomfortable because they contained details about her daily routine, things like what time she left for work, what she wore on certain days, what groceries she bought at the store. Someone was watching her, and that someone wanted her to know it. I told her she should report it to the state troopers, that even though we were a small town, that kind of behavior was not normal and needed to be taken seriously, She said she had thought about it, but did not want to cause trouble, did not want people talking about her more than they already did. I tried to convince her otherwise, but Emily was stubborn in that quiet way some people are, where they smile and nod and then do exactly what they were going to do anyway. I let it drop, but I started paying more attention after that. Started watching to see if I noticed anyone hanging around the diner at odd hours or following her when she walked home. I never saw anything out of the ordinary, which somehow made the whole situation feel worse. The morning she disappeared was a Thursday in early October. I remember because Thursdays were when the supply boat came in, and I had to be at the harbor early to help unload. I stopped by the diner at 6 in the morning like I always did, but when I walked in, Emily was not there. Instead, there was a younger girl named Sarah working the counter, someone who usually only worked weekends. I asked where Emily was, and Sarah said she had not shown up for her shift and was not answering her phone. That was the first alarm bell, because Emily was never late, never missed a shift without calling ahead. She took her job seriously, maybe because it was one of the few things she had that was entirely hers in this town. I went ahead and ordered my coffee, telling myself there was probably a reasonable explanation that maybe she had overslept or was not feeling well. But the unease sat in my stomach like a stone, and I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. After I finished my coffee, I decided to walk over to her cabin, which was only about half a mile from the docks, just to check on her. Several other people had the same idea, and by the time I got there were already 4 or 5 neighbors standing outside her front door, knocking and calling her name. Her cabin was small, just 1 bedroom with a kitchen and a living area, the kind of place that was meant for one person who did not need much. The front door was unlocked, which was normal for our town, so we went inside after getting no response. What we found inside that cabin has stayed with me every single day since. Not because it was gruesome or violent, but because it made absolutely no sense. Everything was in perfect order. The bed was made with the quilt pulled tight. The dishes were washed and drying in the rack beside the sink, and her coat and boots were sitting by the front door where she always left them. But on the kitchen table there was a plate with half-eaten scrambled eggs and toast, and beside it was a mug of coffee that was still warm to the touch. Not hot, but warm, like it had been poured maybe 20 or 30 minutes before we arrived. The food on the plate looked like someone had been in the middle of eating breakfast and had simply stood up and walked away, leaving everything exactly as it was. We searched the entire cabin, every room, every closet, under the bed, in the bathroom. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no overturned furniture, nothing that suggested anything violent had happened. Her purse was hanging on the hook by the door, her wallet and identification still inside. Her phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, fully charged. Her truck was parked outside in its usual spot. Everything that Emily would need to leave town, to go anywhere at all, was still in that cabin. Everything except Emily herself. One of the neighbors called the state troopers, and within a few hours, we had 2 officers at the scene asking questions and taking notes. They did all the things you would expect. Dusted for fingerprints, photographed everything, interviewed everyone who knew her. But here is the part that I still cannot explain, the part that turned this from a missing person case into something that defies any logical explanation. When the troopers went outside to examine the perimeter of the cabin, they found that it had snowed lightly during the night, just enough to leave a thin layer of fresh powder on the ground. There were footprints leading up to Emily's front door from the road, prints that matched my boots and the boots of the other neighbors who had come to check on her, but there were no other footprints anywhere around that cabin. None leading away from the door, none around the sides of the building, none going toward the woods that bordered her property. The snow was completely undisturbed except for the prints we had made that morning. The troopers tried to come up with explanations. Maybe she had left before the snow started falling. Maybe she had walked on the gravel path where snow would not accumulate. Maybe someone had picked her up in a vehicle and she had gone willingly. But none of those explanations held up under scrutiny. The coffee was still warm, which meant she had been there recently, after the snow had fallen. There was no gravel path leading away from her cabin, just snow-covered ground in every direction. And if someone had picked her up, why would she leave her coat and boots behind in October in Alaska, when the temperatures were already well below freezing? Search parties were organized, dozens of volunteers combing through the woods surrounding the town, searching the shoreline, checking abandoned buildings and old hunting cabins. We searched for days, and then weeks, calling her name until our voices went hoarse, looking for any sign that she had been there. We found nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no indication that Emily had ever walked through those woods. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air from inside her own cabin, leaving behind a half-eaten breakfast and a life that was paused mid-moment. The state troopers kept the case open, kept following leads that went nowhere, kept interviewing people who had nothing useful to say. They investigated the letters she had been receiving, but Emily had thrown most of them away, and the few that remained contained nothing that could be traced back to anyone specific. They looked into her past, trying to find someone who might have had a reason to harm her. But Emily had lived a quiet life with no enemies that anyone knew of. The case eventually went cold, not because the troopers stopped caring, but because there was simply nothing left to investigate. I still work at the harbor, still go to the diner most mornings, though it is not the same without Emily there. Sarah took over her shifts permanently, and life in the town moved on the way life always does, even when something terrible and unexplainable happens. But I think about Emily every single day, especially on foggy mornings when the mist rolls in from the ocean and everything becomes gray and indistinct. Sometimes, when I'm standing at the docks alone, I see a figure standing at the edge of the fog, just a silhouette that looks like it might be a woman. It stands there for a moment, not moving, not making a sound, and then it fades back into the mist before I can get a closer look. I tell myself it is just my mind playing tricks on me, that grief and guilt can make you see things that are not really there. But part of me wonders if it is Emily, if she's still here somehow, still trying to tell us what happened to her on that October morning when she disappeared from a locked cabin without leaving a single footprint in the snow. I do not have any answers, and I do not think I ever will. All I know is that Emily Johnson vanished from my town without a trace, and sometimes the worst horror is not knowing what happened, not having any closure or explanation that makes sense. She is still out there somewhere. Or maybe she is not anywhere at all anymore. Either way, I will never forget the image of that half-eaten breakfast on her table, the coffee still warm, the life interrupted mid-moment as if someone had pressed pause on the world and forgotten to press play again.